Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by British Future on behalf of the APPG on social integration. As many of you will know, the APPG has recently published the findings and recommendations of its inquiry into social connection during the pandemic. And the report's called Building Stronger Communities in Post-Pandemic Britain. You can find it on the website of the APPG and also on British Future's website. The inquiry took place from summer 2020 to March 2021 and included a call for evidence which had strong support from 20 organisations, and the APPG also held 5 online evidence sessions. And those who contributed included experts and stakeholders from business, community and the voluntary sector, and people from with an interest in social integration. And the report was written by the MPs involved in the APPG with the support of British Future. Its focus is on stronger and more connected communities, on the role of volunteering and on the role of business as major players in social, in local communities and in people's lives. While it looks at what happened during the pandemic, it's very much a forward-looking piece of work which speaks to the levelling up agenda, which we should hear about more shortly in the white paper. We're very fortunate today in having 4 high-profile speakers with expertise in issues covered by the report who are very well placed to put forward a future agenda on action to continue the extent and reach of social connection which communities experienced during the pandemic. So I'd like to introduce our panel. First of all, Peter Gibson is MP for Darlington and chair of the APPG. He played a key leading role in the inquiry, chairing all of the evidence sessions and identifying key themes and policy solutions. Amelia Quist is Senior Policy Manager at the Federation of Small Businesses. And I've known Amelia for some time because of her work on immigration and small businesses, which has made a really important contribution to debates on immigration policy. And Amelia's work has also focused on the role of small businesses in communities, in the communities where they're located. And in 2019, the FSB produced a report, Small Business Big Heart, which I think, Amelia, you're responsible for writing. And it's amazing that the subtitle for that report is Bringing Communities Together. So it couldn't be more precedent, really. Our third panellist is Andrew O'Brien, who's the Director of External Affairs at Social Enterprise UK, which is the biggest network of social enterprises in the UK. Andrew has a background in the charity sector, having worked for the NCVO and Charity Finance Group. He's very kindly stepped in at short notice, but he has to leave at 2:15. So if you have a question for him, please put it in the Q&A before he has to go. And our fourth panellist is Catherine Johnston, who is Chief Executive of the Royal Voluntary Society. She was appointed to the post after having joined the RVS as a trustee at the start of 2017. She's worked for over 25 years in the third sector, so has a wealth of expertise, including during the pandemic when the RVS played a key role in supporting local communities through volunteering. So each panel member will give a short introduction outlining priorities for how to build on the expertise, on the experience of communities during the pandemic, and lessons for the levelling up agenda. They will then take your questions, which I'd ask you to make in the Q&A function. So when you ask questions, it'd be great if you could say which organisation you're from, as well as your name. So that's enough from me. I'd like to hand you over to Peter Gibson, MP and Chair of the APG, for his opening remarks on how to build stronger communities.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I have to say the challenges of the pandemic didn't bring many pleasures, but one of the pleasures that it did bring for me was being able to participate in this evidence gathering session, effectively detailing what I think is an incredibly positive thing that came out of the pandemic, with almost 12 million people coming forward to volunteer, more than 3.5 million people volunteering for the very first time. And what the report has done is it's highlighted that volunteering is a great way of being able to build the social integration that is the underpinning ambition of this APPG as we build back better, as we level up, to trot in some buzzwords there. They really are key to what the APPG stands for in terms of making sure that our society of people of all races, all backgrounds, all ethnicities, all faiths, creeds, etc., come together to build stronger communities. And you've got there in the stronger communities tag the heading for the report itself. So the pandemic brought about a tremendous challenge for society, and we saw British people right across the country come together to play their role in supporting their communities. And I've talked about this report in a number of ways and used the phrase blitz spirit. And I think for many people there was a wartime feeling to the challenges that they were facing. It wasn't a war against a foreign enemy, it was a war against a problem that we were all facing as a society. And I think we have all seen in our own individual local communities a real positive spirit come out of the way that people wanted to come forward and help. I certainly saw that tremendously in my constituency of Darlington, and I know that colleagues right across the House of Commons saw that in their own constituencies. One of the things that came out of the report that we produced is evidence that where society is better connected, better integrated, with more civil engagement, less poverty, there is greater integration and greater volunteering. And where there is more poverty, less integration, more diverse, less integrated communities, less civic engagement, we saw less connectedness and less volunteering. And so I think that sort of paragraph that I just delivered there effectively sums up what the report is effectively driving at, that by bringing people together from different backgrounds, volunteering on a common cause, they break down barriers between them, they develop friendships and relationships with people that they wouldn't ordinarily have known, and society is better because of it. The report draws upon a massive amount of evidence from some fantastic organisations, which I'm incredibly grateful for them participating in. And we've drawn together in the report almost 20 recommendations for government to help build on that. Key for me are some issues, particularly around that levelling up agenda, with significant funding from both the Levelling Up funds and the Towns Fund going into communities, including my own in Darlington, where we've been successful with a Towns Fund bid, £23 million being spent in Darlington. What we are doing with some of that is helping to improve the community by building space that is better used by the community and can help bring society together. And just to go back to my previous point there about those parts of the country that we saw less volunteering in, I think it's fair to say that they probably have less physical infrastructure in terms of being able to facilitate that community engagement. And I'm talking about things as simple as a sports hall or a gym or a scout hut or things of that nature where communities can come together. So that's a key driver for the messages that come from the report, being able to help direct that Levelling Up Towns Fund agenda in terms of making sure that we do effectively build a stronger community as we build back better. And then to sort of harness the volunteering, it was really telling to see how many businesses across the country have stepped up to the plate, encouraged their employees to volunteer and participate and help their communities. And what we don't want to see is that sort of just falls by the wayside. We want to make sure that is, again, bottled and kept. And whilst businesses go back to normal, what we want them to continue to do is to continue to engage in their communities. And there's no reason why we can't include that volunteering element, that community engagement that businesses have, small and large, and we really mustn't forget about small businesses, and I'm sure Amelia will talk about those as well, because those small businesses are actually the most important glue in our communities, and building on that community engagement, that volunteering from businesses, we think that businesses can be better in their communities by facilitating that, not only for their community, but for their business and for their staff's well-being as well. And one of the other key focuses that we've drawn from the report is about facilitating a greater accessibility for volunteering. We know that there is a willingness for people to volunteer, but we know that as people go back to their normal lives, their perhaps inclination to do so and their accessibility to do so will be reduced. And so by the proposal of effectively a passport platform scheme to enable people to dip in, dip out, dip into one organisation, passport across to another organisation, effectively explore local opportunities for an hour or 10 hours or 5 hours or once a month or twice a week, whatever those availabilities are, they can effectively find something to do that effectively gives back to their community and gives them the opportunity to build a better society for them to live in. You're muted, Heather.
You'd have thought I would have learned after all this time, wouldn't you? Well, thank you very much for some really interesting insights and observations there, and and you mentioned some of the recommendations of the report. And I think the challenges that you said in areas with poor social infrastructure and poor social connection are particularly great. And it's good to hear from your end in Darlington that you have some funding now to enable you to pursue some of the objectives that are in the report. And great to hear you mention businesses, and particularly small business as the glue that holds communities together. So on that note, I will hand over to Amelia, who will talk more about the role of small businesses in levelling up and building back.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I've had a chance to read a lot of the report, and it's really interesting findings, actually really inspiring as well, and insights as well in terms of what small businesses were doing during the pandemic. So as Heather has mentioned, kind of small businesses and communities is something that's quite important to me. Very passionate about the subject, having done lots of research at FSB on the issue. And our research found that many small businesses have close relationships with their local communities. As such, they're uniquely positioned to kind of tackle a number of the social challenges that the report highlights and recommends taking action on. Our 2019 report found that 80% of small businesses have actually contributed or volunteer to a number of community organisations in their localities. And so we see that community focus as something that was going on within small businesses before the pandemic and definitely translated to kind of actions during the pandemic. So 60% of small businesses carried out a volunteer or community role during the pandemic. And one kind of sector that we all know that's been affected by the pandemic and lockdowns has been the hospitality sector. And it was great to see actually a third of small businesses within hospitality have actually donated to food banks and community organisations at the height of the pandemic. Small business community engagement is often based on personal commitments of the small business owner. It often is difficult to separate the individual who owns the business from the business itself and the activities they wish to support. From a small business owner who experience kind of homelessness and may commit to kind of feeding homeless people within Leicester, to a small business that fitted a defibrillator outside their business and trained local people after a customer sadly passed away from a cardiac arrest. So there are so many tales I can tell you, stories I can tell you about small business owners who have directly chosen to kind of be quite active in various issues within their localities because it's an issue that relates directly to their personal experience. And our research demonstrates that small businesses are uniquely placed to identify and support and lead on place-based solutions because they're embedded within our communities. So, obviously looking at there are 5 million small businesses in the UK, small businesses should be at the heart of the government's levelling up plans in towns and areas across the country where it's important to level up. As Peter has mentioned, the area of Darlington where funding has been granted. I'm sure there are many fantastic small businesses in Darlington that are doing great things to support their local communities, but also the fact that small businesses form the majority of private sector employment. So they're kind of key to not only bringing people together in a community aspect, but also through employment. And so looking beyond just the levelling up policies such as the Kickstart scheme are vital to ensure that the country recovers from the pandemic, but also seeks to employ a variety of people, especially young people. FSB, we're kind of really keen to see that the Kickstart scheme is extended beyond March 2022, and also to kind of look at other people within the labour market, such as those disabled people who can maybe be supported via the Kickstart scheme as well. Levelling up is clearly an important issue for the UK as we seek to recover and as we seek to grow and support our communities across the UK. And as I've mentioned, the importance of small businesses in providing that community support. So our previous research found that 10% of small businesses support and provide places for community outreach, so for people coming together. So not only providing kind of employment support, providing financial support, maybe in sponsoring and donating to charitable organisations, but also providing space within communities. And I mentioned kind of monetary issues there, and often enough when people are talking about volunteering and community action, there's that question of how much money are people providing to organisations? And for smaller organisations in comparison to bigger organisations, donating in terms of money is something that they may often struggle with. However, I think our research has found that the ability to donate time is actually quite central to small businesses and their communities. And that ability to provide time in terms of being a leader, providing space, an organisation for local communities is actually really vital and something that needs to be focused on a lot more. I'm sure the report has delves into those issues and touches on a number of recommendations that I'm really interested to talk about and further on the discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amelia. That was really helpful and in adding to some of the issues that we raised in the report. And I think, as you said, the businesses have been involved in so many different ways. So the report focused quite a lot on volunteering, but also in the skills and employment agenda. But I think the point about time is a really crucial one. And that's something that might prove a bit of a challenge for businesses as they get back to normal. But we will see, and hopefully measures we put in place or they'll have the support to enable them to continue the good work that they've done during the pandemic. So now I will hand over to Andrew, who represents the social enterprise sector and obviously has particular expertise in that type of business. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Heather. There's a lot of overlap between what Amelia said and what I'll probably say as well, so I'll try and keep that bit of it brief. But just for those who aren't aware, social enterprises, these are businesses, most of them, 99% of them are small businesses that trade for a social or environmental purpose. So they build themselves around that, often at a local community level, and they trade to generate sustainable income to tackle those social and environmental issues. And there's 100,000 in the UK employing 2 million people and contributing about 60 billion to UK PLC every year. So it's not small. A lot of them are small, but the aggregate together, they make a big impact. And during COVID, just as with their colleagues in the rest of the small business sector, we've seen a significant uptick in engagement at the local level. But basically continuing on their usual work, to be brutally honest. Most social enterprises are already very, very engaged with the local community, but COVID saw some particular examples of that. So, for example, about 60% of social enterprises were giving away free products or services to local communities to get through COVID. So that might be simple things like free food, free medical support, might be running workshops for people for their mental health. A huge range of free activity was provided by the sector. We've also seen a really strong commitment to supporting local jobs and local employment. So, for example, only 19% of social enterprises made staff, 13% of social enterprises made staff redundant compared to 20% of businesses as a whole. And 20% of social enterprises actually increased the number of staffing hours they made available at their business, trying to provide more jobs and more opportunity for local people to get through COVID. And they were also less likely to claim things like the furlough scheme as well, because they recognised that, people want to have that connection to work. They don't just want to depend on welfare and benefits. They want to be able to continue to make that vital contribution. So social enterprise have been aware that part of the responsibility of business in this kind of environment is to make sacrifices and is to go above and beyond to support that national effort. And I think, Peter, you summed up really nicely at the beginning. We have seen a blitz spirit, I think, over the past couple of years. But the problem is the war ends and we will go back to normal. And how do we carry that forward? And obviously we don't want the existential fear and threat that COVID has brought. But equally, we want businesses to continue to see it as their social and moral responsibility, continue to support those communities. And that, I must admit, is a puzzle. And a lot of social enterprises have certainly reported to me, I think, and to other organisations, that although there has been an uptick in the amount of business engagement with communities, some of it is quite superficial. And a lot of it is also based on kind of PR and corporate social responsibility rather than a long-term engagement with those places and people. So how do we see through some of that social wash and really get through to the heart of, are they putting the local places and local communities that they rely on as their consumers, as their market, as their labour market, as their source of support? And how do they prioritise that over the longer term? And I think, of course, there are issues around passporting, which I think is a brilliant idea that Peter mentioned at the beginning. There's issues we can talk about. I'm sure the FSB and ourselves would agree that the business rate system needs to be reformed to support more small businesses and social enterprises that can continue to operate and be at the heart of those communities. But I think the primary issue is a cultural one. And I think we do need to start seeing leadership, I think, not just from government, but I think from organisations like FSB and ourselves and other business leaders to really put pressure on the whole business community to see that this cannot just be a one-off COVID, that actually, we need to step up and do even more. I cannot see how levelling up can be achieved unless businesses are prepared to make more sacrifices to support the local communities, whether that's sacrificing some of their income. It doesn't have to be donations. It can be providing more employment opportunities, investing more in local training, providing that space and time that Amelia said that's important. But, we do need to sort of rally around. And I was very taken by what the Chancellor said during the spending review, that, in this age of optimism, the only limits that we have are our own effort and our willingness to sacrifice. And I think we have seen businesses, when given the right supportive context, are prepared to do with that. I suppose I'm a little bit sceptical about whether that will last. And I think that's really where I think we need government to start thinking about what is the rhetoric, what are the policies, what is the culture that we can create in the business community to sustain this over the longer term. But whatever you do, social enterprises will continue to support this objective. We supported levelling up before the government came up with the concept of levelling up. We'll be there afterwards. And the sector is continuing to grow, I think, as people all across the country think, well, I don't just want to work for profit alone. I want to have profit. I want to make a sustainable living, but I want to give back to communities. I want to support the planet. I want to provide help to people with disabilities or those that are ex-offenders or carers. So they're going to keep doing that work. And I think what we need to do is get behind them and maybe learn some lessons from them about how that culture could be more widely distributed across the private sector. So great event, really interesting report, lots of valuable stuff in it and what stuff that resonates with the social enterprise community's experience. But let's just hope this isn't a missed opportunity. In a few years' time, we wonder where the blitz spirit that Peter said has gone. Hopefully we can revive it, keep it and grow it.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good points. And I think people are often surprised when they hear about the size of the social enterprise sector. And but with that size, also now it can actually bring some influence in the post-pandemic building back debate. And I think particularly the issues that you mentioned around the culture of business, which Amelia also touched on as well. And and the fact that time is often a question of time and resources in local communities rather than other action. Well, thank you very much. We're on to our fourth speaker now, Catherine Johnston, who's going to talk about the role of the voluntary sector, which, as we know, saw a big increase in activity during the pandemic.
Thanks very much. Very nice to be here. And the first thing I should say is I think it's a really good report, and we certainly welcome it from both a Royal Voluntary Service perspective, but also from a Shaping the Future with Volunteering perspective, which I'll come on to in a moment. I think Peter talked about the Blitz spirit really articulately at the beginning, and I think it's somewhere where we can all correlate and share. And obviously Royal Voluntary Service was set up in 1938 to respond to the then war effort and to mobilise 1 million women in communities to support the war effort and to help us all get through. So it has felt certainly from a Chief Executive of Royal Voluntary Service perspective, like we've been back in the front line. But I want to say loud and clear, and actually loud and proud at this point, that whilst I'm on this panel today, there have been thousands of voluntary organisations, if not hundreds of thousands of voluntary organisations, local, hyperlocal, regional, national, who have all played their part in supporting the volunteering effort. And that has both been a joy and a curse in equal measures, because the joy of that is that we've had lots of open doors, lots of opportunities, lots of roles, lots of ways for people to be able to step forward. But the curse of it has been that for all the feedback that we're all getting, it's often very confusing. It's quite difficult, depending on what type of role you're trying to do, where you're trying to volunteer, depends upon what barriers, what hurdles you've got to jump through, how hard you've got to try in order to be able to give your time. And that is fundamentally wrong, which is why I think this report is fantastic, because what it's doing, it's looking for solutions. It's looking for how do we take the 12.4 million and to a degree get over ourselves about who owns the volunteers, who's got to have their logo put all over them, whether or not it's local or national or hyperlocal, whether or not they identify with the term volunteering, or whether actually, giving their time locally is something they call completely different because they come from a different faith-based group, or they come from a different part of the community that doesn't see volunteering in the same way as perhaps Britain, white middle-class traditional may have been. So pre-pandemic, Royal Voluntary Service had written a report, and I'm never going to be able to write a forward again for a report, because it was called Kickstarting a Volunteer Revolution, because I rather politically incorrectly had started to call out the fact that volunteering was becoming the privilege of the wealthy, the people with time on their hands, the people who had access to means. And actually that was a declining part of the population because it was ageing. And we were very fortunate that as part of our civic society, as people were ageing, they were prepared to do more volunteering, not less. And it was masking a massive gap that was appearing in the fabric of our civic society, because less young people were volunteering because they didn't have the time, they didn't have access, it was all a bit too difficult. We don't have universal infrastructure or opportunities. We don't all speak with one voice, not necessarily that we should, but that it was going in the wrong direction. So in this forward, I said, short of a pandemic or a war, oh my goodness me, it's very difficult to mobilise a different approach to volunteering, to kickstart that volunteer revolution. And literally 8 weeks later, we got asked to step forward to support the pandemic. So it has been both a privilege, and actually, I used to be a nurse and run accident emergency units, and ITU units for a living, and therefore, as you can probably imagine, I'm not particularly feeble or afraid of a crisis. But actually, I think I have been equally inspired and frightened over the last 18 months, and I think that has bound all of us together in a way that only a war or a pandemic can. And it's only when the chips are down that we all find ourselves banding together, no matter what our background, where we come from. We talk, pre-pandemic about in a very paternalistic, maternalistic way about hard to reach communities. If any of us ever knew what that meant, it's not for the communities to reach us. They have to be shown where the doors are. And COVID leveled that. It was something that was actually affecting every single citizen, active or not. And therefore people were given the door to walk through. And there were many, many opportunities. Now, we're not going to get that again, hopefully, in the same way, because obviously that's not anything that we want. But I have continued to talk quite passionately about the fact that we have to really challenge ourselves as a society now, and particularly if you have a leadership role, whether that's in the private sector, public sector, state, or charity sector, governments, etc. In what is the society we want to live in, and what is the direction of travel? So if the direction of travel is levelling up, we are awash, and I mean awash, with data, both from the pandemic, but from pre-pandemic. We spent 10 years on the Marmot Review looking at health inequalities. We invested millions and got no further forward in those communities. It is of no surprise for any of the large-scale national charities who involve volunteers that actually we've seen ourselves going backwards in many cases, because people are unable to understand how they can give their time effectively, because traditionally we all make it so difficult. And that's not just national organisations, that's regional, local, that's also in state services like police, retained fire services, Coast Guard, etc. So how do we get to a position where we understand the spectrum of volunteering, that we all agree that giving your time and being able to give your time to your local community or to the cause that you want to support or whatever, actually is not just good for the fabric of civic society, because it builds deeper, broader, more integrated society, but that it's also good for you as an individual, and it is part of you improving your own health. And that you don't have to start from a position of inequality to do that. Actually, if you are in the privileged cohort and you volunteer, you get a lot out of it as well, as long as it's a good, positive volunteering opportunity. So how do we create a spectrum of volunteering that is easy to access? So what we've seen in this phenomenon is 12.4 million people stepping forward, and millions of them for the first time. And I know there's debates about whether it's 3 or 4 or 5. I don't think that really matters. What matters is that we care deeply about where those 3, 4 or 5 million people are going to find their next volunteering opportunity. And if we bog them down with, you've got to now go back to the way the systems were pre-pandemic, that we all sort of lightened up without taking away safeguarding or making volunteering less safe, just to be clear, is if we don't work differently and accept that the landscape and actually the expectations of volunteers has by and large changed, then we'll be going back to Henry Ford, who, when asked about what he thought they would have said at the turn of the century about what sort of transport they wanted, he'd have said faster horses. Actually we need to forget about forecasting and think about the foresight that we all collectively need. And we need to focus on the people that want to volunteer. So we've had an absolute, privileged position to have lots of data. And we did set up a very large-scale micro-volunteering scheme. And actually with that brought lots of opportunities, and in lots of communities, a safety net that was very much needed and is still needed for people where infrastructure doesn't exist. But in other areas, we drove them mad because it looked like duplication, and it confused the life out of communities and leaders. So, we've got lots and lots of learning. And actually part of the reason why I and Matt Hyde, who I think is on the call today, decided to set up Shaping the Future with Volunteering was that it's 24 very large-scale national volunteer involving charities, not because it's an exclusive national club, but because actually we've learnt a huge amount during the pandemic and we want to do better. So we don't want to be Big Brother coming in and looking like we're coming in to save the day. We don't want to be coming in to look like we're undermining local communities. What we want to do is work out how we can make sure that everybody's service provision, all of our opportunities collectively, locally, nationally, sub-regionally, etc., can be made open and accessible for all members of our communities. And that's got off to a really good start, and part of the reason why I was invited to be here today. But we do have to get over ourselves, I think, in terms of ownership. There is this massive issue about who owns the volunteers. None of us own the volunteers. The volunteers are individual human beings who make choices. What we've got to do is serve up appropriate choices, help them to have a good experience and help them to want to continue on their volunteering journey and be able to do that without having to go back to do not pass go, do not collect 200 until you've once again gone through all of the hoops that we make very difficult. We also have to accept that there is not equality across all of our communities across Britain or the UK, in whichever context you want to work. And it's not just a question of sticking in a bit of infrastructure here and a bit of infrastructure there. This is a cultural shift. It's a willingness to build our civic society back better. And as for levelling up, I totally welcome the fact that we want to level up. But I really do think there's a serious conversation to be had for us to say to what? In 5 years' time, what will success look like in levelling up? And I've got a meeting with Andy Haldane and Danny Kruger tomorrow, who are leading the task force with Michael Gove, to actually ask that question, and on behalf of Shaping the Future with Matt, because we really need to know what is it we're shooting for? What is the art of the possible? Because we've all got to modify how we work, both collaboratively and as individual organisations. I've had a great experience with businesses. I think purposeful business is on the rise. And I think social enterprises, small businesses will see the benefit of that because they'll really come into their own. The businesses that helped me largely the most to actually do the last mile for food bags and all of that were largely franchised small businesses, often who belong to a bigger chain, but were doing their own thing in their local community. So, I think we've got so much learning, and I really welcome the opportunity to be here today.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Some really good points there about volunteering. And as you say, it hasn't really been easy for some people to sign up to be volunteers because of all the checks that they have to go through. They don't necessarily know how to sign up. They don't know which types of volunteering are needed by voluntary organisations. And so there's a danger then, obviously, as you said, that people might not continue that really important activity that could otherwise be a cultural shift, and a shift across age groups as well, so that the profile of volunteering changes away from being something that older people do as they're nearing retirement or in retirement to something that people will do throughout their lives. And thank you all the panelists for your comments on the report, and I'm pleased that you found it interesting and relevant to today's agenda around levelling up. I'm aware that Andrew needs to go, so I'm going to go over to questions, and I'll wait for some questions to come in from the participants from the audience today. But I'd like to start with a question, and this is for Andrew, but also the rest of you. So the report, we have something that we haven't talked about in the intros today is high streets and town centres. And a lot of you will be aware, depending on where you live, but I think probably wherever you live, to be honest, that high streets and town centres have taken a bit of a bashing during COVID. There's empty properties. There's probably been a growth of the kind of outlets not necessarily very helpful to local people. And I'm thinking that maybe that's something that social enterprises might have a role in terms of regeneration, but there's also a number of other actors in that process, in particular local authorities through the planning role. So starting with Andrew, I wonder if the panel members could say how they think high streets could be regenerated post-pandemic.
Thanks. It's a really good question. We've got a lot of social enterprises working in the high streets. And actually, over the past 10 years, despite the general downturn in retail activity, we've actually seen an uptick in the number of social enterprises on the high street. I think that's partly because the market has responded to the loss of other businesses by reducing prices and making maybe some of the rents more affordable and opening up more spaces. But I also think it's, the high streets, let's be honest, in a world of e-commerce and clicks and Amazon and so on, it is more convenient to stay at home. So if you're going to go out and actually go to the high street to shop and to buy, you've got to have more of a reason, I think, than just I need a certain product. It's got to have a value. And I think the benefit that social enterprises have, and small family firms have the same benefit as well, is that that the money is going to stay in that community. It's going to recycle through, and you can really feel the benefit that's going to happen. And so we've seen a huge growth in pop-up shops, social enterprise cafes, restaurants, social enterprise retail facilities, and I think that's reflecting a general trend, which is we don't have to be doom and gloom about the high street. I think there are opportunities to revitalise it, but people are only going to participate in that if they feel it's going to have a benefit to the local community. And so I think what we need to do, absolutely, Heather, and I think local authorities and I think Peter's work on the Levelling Up Fund and Towns Fund and others in Darlington is an example of that. We need local leaders to see that we need a new model for how these social spaces, things like high streets, community centres, town centres, are going to operate. And they really should be seen much more as kind of public goods, effectively, rather than just being seen as a commercial space. And I think what social enterprise obviously does very good is it blends public good, trade, profits, all these things together, innovation together, to try to create solutions that work for local places. And I think what we kind of need to continue to see is the Levelling Up Fund, the Towns Fund, the ideas funds that government's putting together can't just be one-offs. And I was pleased to see that the spending review that there's £2.3 billion for the new Levelling Up department to spend over the next few years. I mean, I think to be brutally honest, we should be having kind of a pound for pound model where for every pound of physical infrastructure, roads, railways, fibre optic, broadband we're investing, we should be putting a pound into that social infrastructure around high streets and community development as well, because it's just as important for local economic growth and opportunity. But it's good to see there is starting to get that consistent investment there. We just need to make sure we put it in models which are sustainable. And I think that social enterprises can achieve that. I don't want to bash charity necessarily or the voluntary sector in any way, but I think one of the dangers we have seen in the past, and I have the scars of the big society and others on my back from my time working in this sector, is that, voluntarism can be a wraparound and a kind of almost a decisive tipping point in some of these areas, but we do need models which are based on sustainable income streams. And what we've seen is grant funding as one-off isn't sustainable. It has to move towards something which can generate its own income. And I think that's where the high street has such great potential. I'm really sorry for having to leave a bit early as well. I would have, if I'd have known it was happening, this meeting, I would have obviously booked out all my time, but I have another meeting which I'm actually chairing myself, so I have to be there for it. But really, really delighted to be part of this. And thanks so much, Peter and Amelia and Catherine and others for a great conversation.
Oh, well, thanks for coming along. It's been great to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Great. So, Peter, can I hand over to you on that question about high streets and regeneration? I think it's a particularly interesting point that Andrew raised there about the continuity of funding, because, as you're aware, a lot of initiatives, they kind of come and go. But how do you deal with those kind of issues?
Well, I scribbled loads of notes down while Andrew was speaking, because Darlington has got it's got a fantastic town centre. We haven't got a road that's called High Street, but we've got lots of streets that form our high street in the town centre, and it's a marvellous town centre. Lots of things to say on this front. Towns Fund, Future High Streets Fund, Levelling Up Fund, they are all ways to effectively bringing investment into our towns to effectively create the right infrastructure around a place to make it better. But what government can't do and what local authorities can't do, they can't artificially create a community. That can only come from the people within a community. And so one of the problems that I've experienced and seen in Darlington, people will say to me, we don't go into the town centre anymore, there's no shops there, everywhere's closed, which is simply not true. They may not have been into the town centre for a number of years. They've been shopping online. They've seen one of their particular favourite shops close, so they've stopped going in. And what they've missed out upon, and this will be particularly interesting for Amelia, is that they've missed the opening of those fantastic new independent shops that are in those former shops that were filled by big shop names. So we've got some fantastic independent shops on our high street. And I think we talk about that circular economy and making sure that money stays in our local economy. And we can all vote with our feet. We can vote with our feet by going into our town centres and pledging to, this Christmas, for example, let's make sure that we buy at least 5 presents from the independent shops in our town centre and not go online for them. I know it's a little bit of a pain, it's a little bit of a hassle, but you might meet Santa Claus. You might be able to see a new pop-up cafe that's organised by a social enterprise. You might be able to see something that you hadn't seen before. And if we can encourage people to do that, we can help restore our high streets. Now, also, restoring our high streets is also about bringing different uses to places. And we are seeing from the announcements about the diagnostic centres through the NHS, seeing clinical use of shop spaces. In Darlington, for example, we've seen a number of buildings converted to residential when the residential had all gone from our town centres. We can see across every town centre over the years where high streets have been hollowed out, where there's no flats above shops, there's no housing in the town centre, and an evening they're dead zones. And I think bringing people back in, people of different communities, people of different age groups back into our town centres is a really important way of reinvigorating them. And then you can also use some of those available spaces as community use. So we saw in Darlington, when our large Marks and Spencer's closed, we saw a community organisation come in and open up a pop-up art gallery. We know that there is a rate incentive to the building owner for it to be used for a community charitable use, because they were able to get away with not having to pay the rates for that. So that's a way of filling that space on a temporary basis. It's not a permanent solution, but it's also a way of making our high streets a little bit more interesting and a little bit more diverse. And one of the things that I've talked about in our APPG is a potential for a future report is about how we can explore housing and planning as a way of improving social integration. And there's potential for probably collaboration with the High Street APPG in respect of that. But yeah, my message to everybody, go and buy some stuff on your own high street, vote with your feet and support your local high street, because that money is going to stay in your local economy. That small business has probably volunteered during the pandemic. They've probably volunteered at a food bank. They've delivered prescriptions and supplies to people who were shielding. It's a great way of supporting your local community by shopping local.
Great, thanks, Peter. So Darlington sounds the place to go to for Christmas shopping this year.
Well, it's also where the Chancellor's moved half the Treasury to. So yeah, everyone's coming to Darlington at the moment.
Fantastic. So Amelia, what about the role of small businesses in regenerating our high streets?
Well, I haven't started my Christmas shopping yet, so this is a good reminder for me to start. I think Peter mentioned something that's really interesting. He said, we can't artificially create high streets. They need to come from within the communities. And it reminded me of a story I watched just before the pandemic of a gentleman who was up in Bishop Auckland, and he looked at his high street and had this long desire to kind of create a cafe on his high street. And he opened the cafe just before the pandemic started. And when we saw, businesses close and go into lockdown, I had this, guy at the forefront of my mind, because I thought, this is somebody who's looking at his local community. He wants to give back. He's got this great dream of setting up a cafe. And how has he survived during the pandemic? And there'll be many individuals like that who during the pandemic have, looking at their areas and thinking they want to kind of give back and set up a business. So, obviously speaking from a small business perspective, we want to see individuals have the best support to start a business and give back to their communities. And so for many individuals who've kind of been running businesses, they've incurred lots of debt, especially for businesses on the high street. It's been quite tough for them in terms of rent and being able to pay their rent and come out of that debt and restart their business. So issues such as business rates is really key for many of our members, and something that we'd like to see is that fundamental business rates review. So individuals like the guy I mentioned from Bishop Auckland can start his business and grow his business and obviously then give back to his local community. As Peter also mentioned, that providing community space is central for businesses on our local high streets. And it's really important that we look at issues and policies beyond kind of the levelling up agenda to think about how individuals can set up and run businesses. So policies such as the new enterprise allowance. And I always say to people that anybody can decide to set up and run a business. Could be one of us here today who may choose to go off and do something new. And what support is government providing those individuals to set up a business on our local high streets? Many of our high streets now are sadly quite the number of vacant premises, and what can government do to support individuals to kind of take over vacant premises and to re-energise our local high streets. So lots of ideas. I think our local high streets, as we've seen during the pandemic, are central to our communities, and they really are important to kind of levelling up as we go forward.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. Some really good points that really do need to be addressed to regenerate high streets, which is so important to many communities.
Heather, may I just come back there?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Sorry, there was a point I wanted to make, and then something that Amelia said. So obviously, we had the announcement from the Chancellor with regards to the extension of a rates relief for many town centre businesses, hospitality businesses, cinemas, etc. So I think there are some things that government can do, and I think it's also down to local authorities as well to make their environment as business friendly as possible, and that comes down to things like car parking, etc. One final point that I wanted to make with respect to this, in terms of engagement and making sure that certainly towns fund money is used in the best possible way to make sure that communities are well connected, is by engagement with local MPs, because MPs are appointed to the boards of town funds. So they're there as a watchword in order to make sure that they're connected with communities. And I know certainly the Towns Fund board in Darlington, we've got voluntary representation on that board as well. So there is a way that voluntary organisations and local elected people can get involved in how that Towns Fund money is used to help rebuild that town. Sorry, Hannah.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Peter. So, Catherine, you're welcome to answer those questions, but we've had some questions on the chat, which are really directly in your area of expertise on volunteering. So if I could put those to you, first of all. So a question from Teresa Prunella Norman is it possible that the diverse communities who are identified as not volunteering actually have been volunteering, but they're just doing it in a more informal way, or not in line with the kind of formal definition of volunteering? And then from Jeremy Hughes from Shaping the Future with Volunteering is, could the government do more to incentivise volunteering? So could there be a volunteering equivalent to the support given to fundraising through gift aid? And so do you want to start off with the questions? And do feel free to answer to speak about high streets if you want to.
Okay, yeah, I can cover the high street one off very quickly, because Peter came back and said some of the things I was going to say. You know, there are lots. No, it's great. There are, again, we need to think differently. So if we only go at the regeneration of the high street, so by the way, RVS is one of the largest retailers in the NHS, so we've got quite a lot of retail experience, and we do non-traditional retailing, largely not for profit most of the time. But the point is if you want a high street to be a part of a community, and you need to create the community, then having money as the first and foremost transaction is not going to bring people back to the high street. So you've got to create in parallel other reasons to come. And Peter talked about some of the practical ones, like the diagnostic centres. You know, we're going to be having vaccinations for quite a while for the future. If every high street set up where they've got space, set up their vaccination clinics in and around the high street every year for flu, for COVID, along with some of the, you've got people coming in then to the space because they need to come in not just to buy something, but in order to improve their own health. And you could also then join that up with some of the charity shops and some of the other pop-ups and everything else to make it more of an event. You know, so 10% discount in all charity shops for the 4 weeks when flu vaccinations have been given out, for instance. So there's lots of things you can do to drive business, but not talk about it being an exchange of money in the first and foremost, because that's quite important. In terms of, is it possible others have been volunteering and we've not counted them? Absolutely. In fact, we're banking on it. I guess there's two schools of thoughts. If you are volunteering, and we'll stick with the term volunteering for now because it's the one that's been talked about in the report, and it's informal, so it's something you're doing, you're picking up shopping for a neighbour, you don't see it as volunteering, you're in a local community where there's a care home, and say it's a Jewish care home, and it's a very it's surrounded by a Jewish community, and that community raises money for that care home, and there's a lot of inward investment. They probably wouldn't think that they were either voluntary fundraisers or volunteering for the care home, and that is absolutely okay. This is not about counting widgets, it really isn't. However, what we do need to understand is the motivation and the size and scale of both the existing offer and then the opportunity. And therefore, one of the issues that we have is that if we don't understand who is stepping forward to give their time, and then who is not, we can't actually help to create doors where people who aren't can go through those doors and find a really great opportunity. So there's got to be a mixture and a blend. It's not all about just sticking infrastructure in and saying they've got a great database or a great CRM and we think we're in touch with. It's about underpinning in every bit of planning, every new integrated care system, every town fund, as Peter said, everything else, the voluntary community sector, the focus of volunteering in the concept, the planning, the how do you create civic your own, depth, breadth, diversity of your own communities across the area that you are talking about. And I guess from a national perspective, and I've done lots of local and lots of national, from a local perspective, there's a danger that people go, not invented here, we don't want those big old nationals. But from a national perspective, we can't get in, so we're going to muscle our way in. Actually, if you take some of the organisations in shaping the future, like Scouts, Guides, Ramblers, Citizens Advice Bureau, NCT, RSPB, RSPCA, RNIB, Sense, Stroke Association. These are all organisations who have a very strong local presence in many, many areas, if not all areas. And therefore, somehow by cutting out this national focus, you cut out all of that service provision at the planning concept stage and you only think about local. And I think that's one of the things that I would say we need to change in our the way we frame things, is we're all here to work together to help the people that the charities were set up to serve, to find their way to the services, to have enough service provision. It's going to be a big issue in the next few years, but also to be able to find their way to volunteering opportunities. And I don't think I have come across a volunteer yet whose first and foremost concern is who they volunteer with. I think it's the volunteering opportunity and the difference that they can make. Again, I think we need to understand who is stepping forward to give their time and who isn't, in order to be able to make it better. And then, could the government do more to incentivise? Oh boy, could they? So I guess my challenge would be, and this is meant in the nicest possible way, Peter, is how do we get into the thinking of the people like you who are sitting in the Towns Fund, because you're already there, you're chairing and leading this, so you're one of the best examples that we have of somebody who understands the importance of civic duty, civic community in actually shaping the communities that we live in and the way in which they operate. I don't think that is necessarily as well embedded across the thinking of a lot of your fellow leaders. And that's all parties. That's not just, not any one specific party. And I don't think it's thought about enough when we are handing out money, because the money is so fragmented, things. So if we have to have fragmented funds, so for instance, at the moment, the integrated care systems are being set up, they're appointing all of the chairs and everything else. The current funds that have been handed out to help with the backlog and social care, there's already a big row, quite divisive, emerging about why that money's not going to social care, it's going to health. And the backlog, first and foremost, for the first 2 years. So the money ends up getting in the way of people doing the right thing, or people actually working collaboratively, because there's an argument then about, between health and social care, for instance, as an example. So how do we make sure that the levelling up, all of the funds that sit around integration, both direct and indirect, actually are well understood, that if you start to join up and align some of these stars together, we all get a better result and we get a broader, deeper, more diverse civil society. And I guess that's what some of our thinking that's going on about inclusion in the Shaping the Future with Volunteering is. Let's not make it more difficult to volunteer. So regulators, let's have a conversation with the DBS and the PVG in Scotland regulators and say, how could your businesses be reshaped so that people can passport? We're doing some work with St John's and Red Cross at the moment, where we've put our own money in and we're actually turning our own organisations inside out, upside down, to test actually from real practical application, how can we make it work so that by Christmas, actually volunteers in St John's and volunteers in RVS can move across the two organisations without having to redo every single bit of training, but there's a lot of work that's gone into that in order to just get to that point. And a lot of it's about trust, confidence, and how the regulators perceive the risks. So again, there's more that the government could do to help us all to shape, a much broader, deeper, more engaged civic society with volunteers who get an awful lot out of it, not least of all connectivity. Perhaps we could stop calling people lonely then. It's a much more positive, more proactive model than a let's wait for all the money to be handed down and then argue over it.
Was there a question in there that you wanted me to answer? There was. It felt like I'm at question time, and all the problems are all entirely mine.
No, I was holding you up as a shining example of somebody who understands at MP level. Actually, if you bring all of these things together in place and you look locally, hyperlocal, local, sub-regional and national, and align it and look at the investment across sectors, you get such a better outcome. And you're doing it in Darlington, in spade loads, and there are other areas. So how do we capture the Bradfords, the Darlingtons, etc., and play those forward?
So can I just say in response to that, every town that's had a Towns Fund deal, I don't know the detail in terms of levelling up, but certainly in respect of the Towns Fund, MPs in their communities are appointed to the boards of those. The boards are then made up of a series of volunteers, typically from the private sector and the public sector. But what I would say is that both Amelia from the FSB and yourself from RVS, you can send out a message to your membership across the country, highlighting those locations that have got Towns Fund deals, and say, this is an opportunity for you to influence local policy, how that money is being spent, and how do you want to see that money spent in our local community that makes stronger communities, that facilitates volunteering, that supports local businesses, and helps build those stronger communities that we're talking about. So I don't think everything's the responsibility of government. I think sometimes, we need to accept that it's sometimes down to individuals in their communities, be that a group, a charity, a voluntary organisation, a business, coming forward and saying, we accept it's not always the government's fault. It's not always the government to blame. The government's handing out the cash to these places, but it's actually the local community itself that's got to come forward and say, this is what we want this place to look like. This is how we shape it. And this Towns Fund opportunity is a great chance to do that.
I think that's a really good, fair challenge, Peter.
So yeah, I've turned it straight
and
back.
There's 101, and in the chat bar, they've just been published. So anybody else on the call can do exactly that.
And so thanks very much for that. Amelia, I don't know whether there's anything you want to add, bearing in mind Peter's comments there, anything you want to add about what you would like to see the government do? I suppose in terms of particularly encouraging volunteering that involves small businesses.
Or just directly on the point that Peter made about the Towns Fund, I think definitely we have our local development managers are looking at that list quite closely. And I think there are already many members that are very keen to get involved and share their thoughts with local MPs, etc. But in terms of what the government can do, I've talked earlier about the report that we published a few years ago about community involvement from small businesses. And I think one of the things that many of our members mentioned, those who are somewhat active and who want to do more, is being able to be connected to local community organisations. And I don't necessarily think that's a role for government to kind of connect various people, but it's something that both business and voluntary organisations, community organisations need to come together a lot more to kind of identify where they are and how they can work better together. We've obviously seen examples of that during the pandemic, but it's something, as we've mentioned, as people go back to kind of more ordinary lives, as to how they can work closely together. And I think that issue of who are people within our communities, I want to support X, Y, and Z, but I'm not sure where they are, is something that definitely still remains a challenge. And for organisations such as FSB and organisations that Catherine works with to partner up and have those conversations a lot more closely as to how we can work better and connect individuals.
Well, thanks very much. And actually, your response there, Amelia's answered a question in the chat from Dragana Vidovic, who asked how small businesses can identify what community needs are and what causes to support. And I think you've given some good indications there of how that might be done. There's been lots of questions. So I think we've just got time for one more question from the Q&A, which is basically is from Amanda Aris, who says, that despite all the kind of positive stuff that happened during the pandemic, there's been levels of aggression towards frontline workers and signs of greater division alongside the kind of greater social capital that we've seen. So what do the panelists think that government, businesses and charities can do to tackle these divisions and social strains? Great question. Thank you, Amanda. Who would like to? We haven't got very long left, but who would like to answer that? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to pick that up.
Thanks, Peter.
I mean, I appreciate that there are challenges with a whole range of services that are out there as people are short-staffed or are isolating, and quality and service we have seen deteriorate as people face the challenge of recruiting. And that's had a knock-on impact on people. And I've seen that myself in my own community. I've personally experienced it myself with access to a variety of services. I think we just need to be strong in reiterating the message that aggression to anybody on the front line doing any job, be it somebody behind the post office counter, be it the guy driving the bus, be it the person sweeping the street, is absolutely not acceptable in our society. And just because we've had a pandemic and just because we've dealt with the challenges of COVID does not make it acceptable to treat people in the way that they do when they sit at home being keyboard warriors and spilling their bile against everybody in the public domain to people on the street that they face.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Amelia, is that something that small businesses have been aware of and had to develop strategies towards? And what would you want government to try to do about that?
Yes, I agree with a lot of the points that Peter has made. I think one of the difficulties for small businesses as we reopened was many business owners felt like they had to be the kind of the guardians kind of COVID regulations, and as COVID regulations continuously change. Kind of looking back, I think this time this year we had 10 p.m. curfews and different things changing all the time, and it was quite a struggle for small businesses to enforce some of those rules. We've got different rules around face masks and in different localities, etc. And that has caused many frustrations within the public and people feeling it's perfectly acceptable to shout at people and raise their concerns in public spaces. I think one thing that the government can do is just try and support people in providing clear guidance on what they should do, what they shouldn't do. Is we're still, to a certain extent, it's great that we're reopened and many people are going out doing things as they did before, but we're still within this kind of pandemic world and things aren't completely normal, if we can use that phrase. And so having a kind of clear guidance and support and direction from government is really useful for smaller businesses who are often out on their own, kind of deciding how to implement lots of different rules and regulations from government.
Thank you. Catherine, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, so I mean, there's no magic answer to this at all. I think so. If you take the work that we've been doing with vaccination, we've had to be very careful that we've risk assessed and ensured that volunteers, and this goes for all volunteers in whatever their volunteering opportunity is, are safe, supported, and protected to a degree. So if we think that there is a likelihood of backlash, so for some steward volunteers in vaccination centres, they may or may not have experienced some bad PR and publicity outside their vaccination centre from the anti-vax lobby, for instance. So it's about assessing the environment, the situation, and always having at the forefront that you want to mitigate and protect and then support the volunteers to make sure that they're equipped to deal with whatever comes down the line. I don't think you'll drive it out, but I do see a difference in the last 18 months, back to Peter's Blitz sort of spirit. People are, have been kinder, they've been more tolerant. We've had more diverse, who'd have thought that, we'd have lots of volunteers from the Afro-Caribbean community in Wembley, for instance, at the vaccination centres. They would never traditionally have volunteered for Royal Voluntary Service or the NHS, but they themselves are talking about how they feel much more connected. They've experienced less backlash as a result, and so the band played on. It's about building the society we want to live in and dealing with it firmly, but listening at the same time, I think.
Thank you very much. I think we've probably got just time for one last question, which is really about the role of local authorities to support greater connection in ways that doesn't take a lot of investment when council budgets are tight following the pandemic. Who would like to answer that? Peter, do you have any views on the role of local authorities in supporting the work of national government?
Well, I can talk about, again, Darlington. I'm sorry for banging on about Darlington. It's fundamentally why I'm here, and it's the source of the majority of my examples of things that we've been discussing. So my apologies for that. But in Darlington during the pandemic, we had a new charity that was set up to facilitate those volunteers who were helping with house-to-house deliveries and ferrying people who'd been shielding around, etc. And that was done very much in conjunction with the infrastructure of the council. They provide telephone bank services, they provided access to CRB checks, etc. So they very much worked with that charity in order to facilitate that local response in Darlington. And I know that that was replicated in other local authorities. I think it's about a willingness of the leadership at the local authority, be that the political leadership or the officer leadership, about their willingness to engage with the community. I think too often we hear the cry that local authorities' problems are down to not enough cash, and it isn't the case at all. I firmly believe that a lot of local authorities' problems are led from the fact that they have perhaps poor leadership, or they have poor officers in charge that are not necessarily responding to the problems in their specific community appropriately. And if they directed the resources that they do have in a better way, they could respond better to their community. That's not to say that local authorities have all of the resources that they always want and will do forever. I fully appreciate the challenges of local government finance, but I think the fundamental problem there is about having the right relationships. My community is a very well connected community. It's very well supported. There's a lot of cooperation between local authority, civic society, third party or third sector organisations who are working together and helping. And I know that that's not replicated right across the country. And I think it comes back to perhaps the point I made at the very, very beginning about where we didn't see volunteering coming forward, where we've got less connected societies, we've perhaps got poorer leadership in local government, more deprived communities. And so the cycle and the problem continues rather than in an upward cycle, in a downward cycle.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if there's anything, Catherine or Amelia, you want to quickly add, because we are nearly at the end of the session where we are kind of out. Yes, Catherine, please.
I've just seen Julie Siddiqui posting the thing, we all want a Peter. So we're needing to clone you, Peter, so that you could go to and have all of the local authorities well led. So I absolutely agree. This is a leadership. Money is important, and resources, but so is experience, ability to collaborate, people with vision. Well led often leads to a much better utilisation of the resources that are available and much better outcomes, no matter what your starting point is. So, it's really important that we encourage, as Peter was suggesting earlier, colleagues to engage more broadly than perhaps they did pre-pandemic or even during the pandemic. We know where the challenges are, and often it's not of their own making. Often it's they've started from a real deficit position, and they're trying to level up. And if you constantly bash when you're trying to level up, they're never going to get there. So I think we need to be kind, but be supportive.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've reached the end of the session. So I'd like to thank members of the panel for their contributions and insights, especially for their thoughts on how the positive experiences of pandemic and lockdown around social connection and integration can be continued as we emerge from the pandemic and develop and put in place levelling up strategies. And thank you all for coming. So the APPG will be continuing its work on key issues around social integration. And to find out more and to keep in touch, please follow the APPG on Twitter and follow British Future as well. And also sign up to the mailing list so that you'll hear about future work of the APPG. So thanks again to the panel, and thanks everyone for coming.